his recent trip to the Middle East, President Barack Obama tried to reignite the stalled peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, while Iran and Syria continue to demand attention. With a new Secretary of State in place, what is the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East? Let's find out from our experts. Samer Arabi is the Government Relations Manager at the Arab American Institute and a contributor to a number of foreign policy sites. And Omri Saran is an advisor with the Israel Project. We also have a guest in New York, Mr. Gianni Pico, who's a consultant and advisor to the Oxford Research Group. And as some say, an old hand in the Middle East. He has worked with multiple UN missions to broker ceasefires in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and on and on and on. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start with the recent Obama trip to the Middle East, followed immediately by Secretary of State Kerry's talks in the Middle East with both the Palestinian and Israeli side. Do you see, I'll start with you, Samer, any hope of rekindling the process?
I do see some hope, but I see hope in spite of the process as it stands and in spite of the actors that are currently in charge of it. A lot of us expected that Obama's trip to the Middle East wouldn't focus on Palestine issues simply because Obama lacked any kind of coalition here in Washington that would push any kind of substantive change in terms of Israel's settlement developments, in terms of a lot of the concessions that people had to make, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side. But we also saw a lack of government interest on the Israeli side to push any kind of meaningful negotiated settlement. So we weren't expecting much, but I think Obama's push signals that it will be a high priority for his coming second term. I think it will be a priority for Secretary of State Kerry. And I think there's a definite interest on the ground, if not necessarily within the representative governments, for a real peace process to emerge.
Omri, do you see both President Obama and Secretary Kerry trying to make a legacy? The second term is also called the legacy term.
Yeah, I don't know how much of a legacy they're going to push for. I think that, you know, it's probably right to say that expectations were low regarding the peace process. I don't think that they were so low because of a lack of interest on the Israeli side. In fact, as the president was arriving, you saw the creation of a new Israeli coalition in which the top party and the second party and the party that had been brought in first were all committed to the peace process. And in fact, the first party that was brought on was explicitly a party that ran on a peace process platform. The problem is that there are fundamental barriers on the ground. There is, for instance, the split between the Fatah-controlled West Bank and the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. It's very difficult to envision what a state of Palestine would look like in the world where you have two different governments ruling over the territory. And so there are fundamental impediments. The second problem is the problem that you addressed when we began today, which is there are broad dynamics in the region that are forcing people to pay attention to them above and beyond the peace process. When Syria is collapsing, when the Egyptian security forces are in a cold war with Hamas in the Sinai Peninsula and may not be able to uproot jihadists, when Iran is developing a nuclear weapon, those things are all more immediate, and it pushes talk of a legacy aside, I think.
Okay, let me come to you, Mr. Pico, in New York for a second. We started with Israel and Palestinian issue, but there are so many other things going on in the Arab world right now. Iran's on the agenda. Syria's on the agenda. Secretary Kerry was in Iraq telling them, do not let the Iranian planes through that have weapons. What would you characterize as the top issue in the Middle East for the Obama administration?
Well, I think what the first observation I would like to offer, for whatever it is worth, is that time has an effect on human beings and also on what human beings do. Accordingly, I think that to look at the Middle East or the general area that you're referring to as if history had not happened and time had not passed would be inappropriate and wrong. The Middle East has changed dramatically in the last 15 years, with or without Palestinians and Israelis. And that change, I think, is what is the major driver of the region at this point. And we've seen that major developments has been the developments in Iraq and in Syria, which tell us the story of how history keeps going on and never goes backward.
But what issue do you think should the Obama administration focus on right now? Is it Syria and whether to help the rebels and how much to help them? Or is it Iran and the possible development of a nuclear weapon?
sometimes we speak about countries as if they represent different subjects. In fact, there are borders in the Middle East which don't exist, in fact, because I think the Middle East should be looked in its complexity, in its entirety. The real issue in this more point, in my view, is Iraq and Syria, but not for the purpose that probably some people have in mind. Iraq and Syria indicate to us that the core players are Saudi Arabia and Iran.
As you said, the core players are Saudi Arabia and Iran, and we see their hand in the broader Middle East and in other parts of the world, like South Asia, which is where most of our audience are from. So before we move on, let's find out what our audience think about Middle East. Sarah Zaman is our social media correspondent. She's waiting for us at her social media desk. Sarah, what do you think people are saying?
All right, Aisha. So in light of President Obama's visit to the Middle East, we asked our viewers, what do they think America can do to solve the Middle East crisis? Now, as I'm looking at the feedback, it's sort of mixed. But the one overarching theme is that most of the people feel that America is not willing to play a very constructive role, and in fact, they think America might be part of the problem. Shazar Rahman says U.S. should not interfere in this matter. In fact, U.S. is the one that raised the riot by supporting Israel. Ramzan Mahri says America is the only one that can solve the issue, but it does not want to do so. And Altaf Khan says, sorry to say, but the U.S. policies in the region are dictated by the Jewish lobby, so U.S. will only pass time and will not do much more. Some commenters are saying that to bring peace in the region, America should sincerely put pressure on both Israel and Palestine to refrain from violence, uphold human rights, and completely ban the use of weapons. We also have a comment from a student, Mohammad Hamza, in Islamabad, about the role that America can play in ending the conflict. Let's see what Hamza has to say.
There should be uniformity in the policy of United States for both Israel and Palestine, because United States, when talk to Israel, they have some other behavior, not same as when they talk to Palestine.
And just like Hamza, Aisha, I just want to sort of let you know about the overarching theme. Just like Hamza, many other people on our social media platforms also feel that the U.S. policies are basically heavily tilted towards Israel, and just wanted to remind our viewers that if they want to participate in this conversation or read some of the comments that other viewers are leaving, just come to our Facebook page at Access Point with AT, or you can join the conversation at Urdu VOA's Facebook page. Back to you, Aisha.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And back to you, Omri. I want to ask you, this is the problem when you are the superpower of the world. People want you to be involved, but they don't want you to be involved. They want you to put pressure, but they don't want you to put pressure. This is an overarching sentiment we hear from a lot of Muslim countries, which is the U.S. pressure on Israel and the Palestinian people is not equal.
Sure. So two things about that. The first is the way we entered this conversation was a question of why are Saudi Arabia and Iran engaged in a proxy war across the region, right? And it's not just Saudi Arabia and Iran. If we just look at Syria, only Syria, forget what's happening in the Gulf countries, just Syria, we have a proxy war with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar on one side, and the Shiite-backed regime on the other. That conflict is also taking place in the Gulf. It's mirrored in the Gulf. We know, of course, that Saudi Arabia recently announced that they had caught Iranian spies on their soil. Yemen had intercepted a ship of arms from Iran to Yemen. None of that is happening because of anything that goes on in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And when you talk to those countries' leaders, they very much know that the stakes have very little to do with what's going on in the Near East, let alone in the Israel and Palestinian situation.
Okay, and you seem to disagree.
I would absolutely disagree. I mean, obviously there are endogenous issues in each of these countries that are being handled, and all of that is coming out in these spate of Arab uprisings that have happened in the past 2 years. But if you look at the rhetoric that has come out of any of these places, the fact that there's a cleavage between these GCC conservative Gulf countries and what is called the axis of resistance, right? The Syrian, Iranian, Hezbollah, and until recently Hamas group, which in no way is actually legitimately resisting anything meaningful, but the rhetoric is rhetoric based around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the fact that some groups ally themselves with U.S. interests and other groups directly oppose U.S. interests use the Israeli conflict as a foil for that process.
Okay, let me move this forward a little bit, and I want to bring Mr. Pico in, since he is, as we said in the beginning, an old hand in the Middle East. It's a very complicated region, Mr. Pico, and U.S. Has tried to kind of juggle with the post-Arab Spring Middle East and not really sure about what to do with it. Where do you think the U.S. stands, and where do you think the U.S. needs to go from here in the Middle East?
Well, as I said before, I never worked on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, so I will not speak about it, for I have no enough knowledge to say anything about it. I just want to answer your question by reminding you that the Middle East of the 1990s is no longer the Middle East we live today, and indeed the entire region is, in my view, in a different set of players as well. The relevance today of Saudi Arabia and Iran, as I mentioned before, is really the core of the entire region, and whether the names of this country comes up or not in conflicts which are ongoing in the region, I think they definitely are relevant, and they have taken on a position and a role which they did not have 20 years ago. So this is the change I think should be there. We should focus on that to understand what is going on, and change, as we all know in life, is the core issue of life.
Mr. Pico, you talk about change, and Syria is changing very rapidly. Very recently, the Arab League allowed the Syrian opposition to sit in the official seat of a Syrian over the protests of President Bashar al-Assad. And they've also opened their first embassy in Qatar today. It was today or yesterday. I can't remember. So Syria's changing rapidly, and America is still on the fence about what to do. What would you advise the U.S. government to do?
That is a job I don't have, to advise the U.S. government. I'm very glad not to have it. I think that what we are looking at is really, for the first time in 1 century, the architecture of the Middle East is changing. Let's not forget that what we have in the Middle East as an architecture goes back to World War I, and then, of course, with the creation of Israel, World War II, the end of World War II. So we're speaking about an architecture which is a century old, and in no other part of the world has an architecture which was built after World War I. So change is part of what we are condemned to see. The question is, can we in some way have a peaceful change rather than a warlike change? And I think that is the hope we can all try to materialize in some way.
Okay, let's come back to the Middle East issue, the Israel and Palestine issue. Middle East is so big, and all of these other countries are in the Middle East, but I don't know why we call this issue the Middle East peace process. Before I go on to ask another question, we also have some other comments about this particular issue. Let's go back to Sarah Zaman, who has some more comments for us. Sarah, over to you.
Right, Aisha, I first want to share a video comment that we got from Islamabad about the role that the United Nations can or should play in bringing peace between Israel and the Palestinians. After that, we'll take a quick look at what some of you think Arab countries should do in resolving this issue. So first, let's see what our commenter Zafar Abbasi from Islamabad says.
United Nations, up till now, they haven't stressed American people, their politics and authorities to play their vital role for to solve the problem between Palestine and Israel.
So Aisha, here also, as we can see, the emphasis is on convincing America to be the change maker in the Middle East. As for what our commenters expect from the Arab world on this issue, Rahman Majid says Arab countries don't seem united or willing to solve this issue. Mohammed Baloch suggests Arab countries should withhold oil supplies to European countries. This will quickly solve the problem. And some other people on our social media platform also are agreeing with this pressure tactic. But Gul Arman comments that Arab countries should unite and try to persuade other countries to understand their point of view and then put pressure on Israel. Several commenters, however, do not think Arab countries can be relied on. They think countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar are U.S. allies and will not oppose its policies in the region.
Thank you, Sarah. And we see that out there, the opinion is really divided. The Arab countries should unite. They can't unite. U.S. should put pressure. That brings me back to a very interesting observation. What President Obama did in Jerusalem is he talked to the youth of Israel, and he took a really humanist view. Look at the world from a Palestinian's eyes. Samir, do you think that would make a difference?
I certainly think it's a good first step, and it's something that we haven't seen before. The idea that the Palestinian experience and Palestinian suffering is being humanized and being recognized by U.S. at the highest levels says a lot, I think, and it's a very good step in the right direction. And it shows that the U.S. is capable, if not necessarily institutionally willing, of being a more neutral broker in this entire process. And I think a lot of these comments that we heard from Facebook and the videos showed this kind of contradictory ambivalence where people want the United States to step up and take that role. They want the United States to play the role that it and only it can play in brokering a peace, while they're very upset about the idea that the United States is seen as a one-sided broker to peace, that it's an unfair arbiter. And I think Obama is opening the door for a conversation about the U.S.'s role in solving this peace process. And frankly, that can only be done if they do recognize the suffering of the Palestinian people, if they do recognize the century of oppression that they've faced, while recognizing the legitimate suffering of people on the Israeli side as well. And for it to be able to play that neutral role, I think would do a lot.
And you make a very important point that the other side also has to recognize Israel's concerns and why, Omri, I'd like you to elaborate, why does Israel feel such concern about its security?
Well, I mean, the Israelis feel concerns for obvious reasons. The day that Israel declared independence, it was invaded by 5 Arab nations. It repeated peace offers in the aftermath of wars in which the Israelis were victorious were turned down. In the aftermath of 1967 and 1973, both defensive wars fought by Israel, the Arab nations said that they would remain committed to having no relations with Israel. And then, of course, we get to the Madrid and later Oslo peace process and later Oslo II peace process, in which Israel made territorial concessions and was met with rockets and terrorism.
I'll interrupt you here, and I want you to comment on what President Obama said in his address, which is he talked to the Israeli youth and said, don't think of yourself as victims. Think of yourself as the biggest military power in the region, backed by the biggest military power in the world. Do you think that the history has changed?
So this is actually an interesting debate because it gets us into the question that you asked a while ago, which is there, when the president said, put yourselves in Palestinian shoes, why was that move made? It wasn't a new move. In fact, the president literally said, as I've said before, when I look at Palestinians, I see humans and you should do the same. And it won't move Israeli public sentiment all that much. Already, a huge majority of Israelis support the peace processes, which is why you see the kind of government that they just empowered, a centrist pro-peace process government. What was important about that speech is the president was willing to say, listen, of course, both sides need to recognize that the other side is human. Of course, I've been saying that for a while, but it's important for me as the American president to emphasize the close ties between Israel and the United States, because only when the Israelis feel that they have the backing of the world's most powerful military will they feel confident enough to continue making concessions for peace. Because, remember, the last round of concessions they made, most dramatically the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, in order to give a Palestinian state breathing room to develop, they were met with rockets.
And you want to disagree?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the idea of a withdrawal from the Gaza Strip is itself a not completely fair statement, considering that it's still under complete blockade and sanctions.
Well, it's under blockade after, not before.
Yeah,
after the rocket. Although some people say, including Fatah, that Israel withdrew from Gaza without talking to us and letting us make the right concessions. They withdrew nonetheless. Let me Summer, and I know you want to jump in there, so feel free to do so. Let me tie Iran into this situation. A lot of people around the Muslim world say, and a lot of our audiences are in South Asia, which is, why is such a hue and cry over Israel's nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, when Israel already has nuclear weapons? So I want you to comment on that, and then I'll go to Mr. Pico to find out what are the wider concerns about the region if Iran gets nuclear weapons. So
let's be very clear. The global community has focused on Iran's nuclear weapons as a genuine threat to regional stability and to global stability. But let's not say that it's the international community or Israel that's disproportionately focusing on Iran. Assume, and it's the case, that Arab leaders have believed that Israel has had nuclear weapons for the better part of a decade and a half. Let's make that assumption. They never talked about needing their own nuclear weapons. Only when Iran began to get close to acquiring nuclear weapons did you see Arab states begin to say out loud, if they get it, we're going to need it. So this isn't a question for Israel and the international community. It's a question that could be addressed at the Arab states, and we know what the answer is, because Iran has committed, because the fear is that Iran will use their nuclear weapons to make territorial mischief.
And you want to add?
Yeah, again, I think that's an unfair characterization. And the Arab states have been complaining for decades about Israel's nuclear program to the United Nations and everyone who will listen.
But they weren't proliferating.
But the problem is that this kind of push towards Iran's nuclear ambitions, which frankly most independent observers say is years away from developing any kind of nuclear weapons capability.
Most of them?
Yeah, almost every expert observer will say, including the U.S.'s own intelligence capabilities.
And President Obama has said more than a year, at least.
Yeah,
So
and the fact that we put this undue pressure on it, specifically because Israel expects this undue pressure on it, only reinforces this narrative
I have to
of
jump in
most
on
favored
that.
status
Just very
and this
specifically,
willingness.
we know that in 2010, the UAE ambassador to the United States said it would be worth the costs to gain the benefits of attacking the Iranian nuclear program. We know from WikiLeaks that in 2008, the Saudi king said the U.S. must attack Iran and cut off the head of the snake. Those
Yeah.
aren't theories. Those are facts.
You're right, and we know from the Arab uprisings that we shouldn't listen to only the leaders of these Arab states to understand what Arabs want and think. That's not
Okay.
a legitimate way of looking at this conflict.
Mr. Pico, I want to jump in here and get to you because you've been involved in these kinds of situations before. Iran, when it's going after the nuclear weapons, some experts have said that by attacking Iraq on the basis that it might acquire a nuclear weapon, the U.S. might have given reason for Iran to speed up its need for a nuclear weapon.
First of all, I want to congratulate both your speakers in Washington, because it was very interesting for me to listen to their comments, which I appreciate very much. Let me just tell you one thing. It's fascinating when you speak about Iran, that we have been talking about Iran nuclear weapons. I'm talking about governments being talking about it ever since 1991. In fact, the press in many countries in the West and in the Middle East has been informing the world that Iran was one year away from the nuclear weapons, or 1.5 or 2 years since 1991. And the second point which I would like to make is it fascinates me that all the discussions about the difficulty of negotiating with Iran, something which I've done with some success from 20 years ago onward, we never recall that Iran and the West have been engaged in negotiation with each other at least 12 times, to my knowledge, and 11 of those 12 times the results have been positive and successful. So I think when speaking about Iran, I think it's time to put down the titles of the newspapers and to look at the reality, because I think one has to realize also the fact that, as I said before, things change. Yes, like the question of Iraq and the attack on Iraq has had a tremendous impact on the region, because, as your distinguished guests in Washington know very well, in the mind of many, that war allowed 1534, the events of 1534. We are all too young to remember that, but I do remember. In 1534, something major happened in Baghdad, and thanks to the war of the last 10 years against Iraq, that events of 1534 were undone, and somebody was pleased with that, and some others were displeased with that, because Iraq has completely changed, of course, their position in the region.
So, Mr. Pico, since you've been involved in negotiations with the Irani establishment, I want you to answer this question. The pressure on Iran today, do you feel it's undue?
No, pressure is always part of a negotiation, so that it should not be characterized as if it was something particularly new or ill or not well thought. I think when you speak about Iran, I think time has come to call a spade, and to say this negotiation have got to be conducted between Iran and the United States. And I was very pleased a few months ago when, for the first time, the government in Washington actually said very clearly that they are in favor of bilateral negotiation. Finally, we got there. It took us a long time, and I think that's the way it should be done.
Okay, so you're in favor of bilateral negotiations. What do you think will it take to get the two sides to sit at a table?
They already have indicated to each other that they are prepared to have bilateral negotiations. And this has been made public already by both sides. And as I said, the great movement made in Washington in the last few months was exactly that. The indication that the American government is prepared to sit down for bilateral negotiation with Iran, which is, I think, the most logical thing to do. And let's not forget also, because one of your guests early on mentioned, I think, for the region, the role of the United Nations. I think that one has also to be realistic. Yes, I did work for that organization for a few decades, but the fact is that the United Nations in the last 20 years, to be specific, in fact, I would say 20 or 21, has not been very successful in conflict resolution, because multilateralism in conflict resolution is no longer the tool. The tool for conflict resolution is mini-lateralism, if you allow me the invention of the expression.
Okay, now let's move very quickly to, we've talked about Iran. Mr. Pico says there needs to be negotiations. We'll see how that pans out. Syria. Kerry was in Paris discussing Syria and whether and how to arm the rebels. What do you think, starting with you, Omri, should the U.S. do in Syria?
It's a very complicated situation. I think that anybody who has the bravery to say this is exactly what should happen has probably just not thought through the situation. It's a very complicated situation. It is there's two tracks that need to be pursued. One is we have to address the problem inside Syria. We have to empower the moderates one way or another to at least assert themselves. But we need to recognize that Syria is a regional problem. It is, in every sense, a regional proxy war that a month and a half ago was being fought inside Syria and now has spilled across the borders into Lebanon and into Jordan. Hezbollah's missiles today are pointed north. They're not, not all of the 70,000 of them, but they have pointed missiles north. Why? Because the war has spilled over into Lebanon. It's a regional problem and has to be addressed at a regional level.
Summer.
It does, and I think the U.S. is stuck in a very difficult situation between balancing a desire to see an Assad-free Syria and a worry that the people that they're empowering inside Syria are the very radical Islamist militants that they've been fighting in Iraq across the border. And so I don't know how that game is going to be played out. I think there has been a gradual shift towards a greater militarization of the conflict that the U.S. has somewhat, against its own volition, been pushing. Those of us who don't think that this conflict should have been militarized, it's too late to even discuss that now. There's clearly no other option for this. And I agree. I think moderates do need to be empowered. I just don't know if the U.S. or any other Western powers have the capability to do that in any meaningful way.
Mr. Pico, do you think, A, should the U.S. supply weapons to the rebels? And B, this is a problem U.S. has had since the beginning of the Arab Spring. They don't know who's going to come after the spring, whether it's going to be the moderates or the extremists that they have been fighting all along. So what to do?
I think the conflict, as your guest in Washington have mentioned very correctly, is a regional conflict. Has been a regional conflict for some time. In fact, I wonder if it is appropriate to call it a Syrian conflict when it is much more than that. And in that context, I would only mention in 20 seconds that the way I see it, I would look at three levels to deal with this situation. The first level is to have an understanding between Russia and the United States. The second is, more importantly, to have an understanding, profound one, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And thirdly, at the third level, I think then and only then, the Syrians will find their way out.
So Saudi Arabia and Iran, that sounds like a long shot to me. Is it a long shot, or am I just thinking?
It's clearly a long shot, and it's not very likely, but I do think that he happens to be right, that Syria has become a battleground for all of these different regional international wars. And I would also add the layer of the entire GCC area versus the so-called resistance axis. It's also being the battleground of the Shia-Sunni divide. It's the battleground of the sectarian divide.
So quickly, because in the last 20 seconds, should then the U.S. be negotiating between Iran and Saudi Arabia as opposed to?
Now, if the U.S. can negotiate with Iran successfully, they're not going to get trilateral, and the Saudis will freak out if they try to do it. Right? The Saudis will think that the U.S. is abandoning them if they try to triangulate between them. It's a problem that the region is going to take a long time to solve.
It's a complicated region, and we can talk about it forever, but unfortunately our time today is up. I must thank our guests, Samer Arabi, Omri Saran, and Gianna Pico, and don't forget to leave your comments on our Facebook page or to follow us on Twitter. We look forward to reading them. Until next week, goodbye.